Okay, this is a reading of Truth and Finitude, Heidegger's Transcendental Existentialism by the late great philosopher and physicist John Haugeland. In their lengthy and powerful appendix to Dreyfus's Being in the World, Dreyfus and Rubin argue that the existentialist portions of Being and Time, those having to do with authenticity, falling and anxiety, death, conscience, guilt, and resoluteness, are an attempt to secularize Kierkegaard's notion of religiousness A, while also incorporating certain features of his religiousness B, though without the latter's essential risk or vulnerability. If you don't understand what they're talking about, just stick with me for a couple minutes. They conclude, however, that for all its ingenuity, this attempt results in an inconsistent position and is therefore a failure. It is undeniable that Heidegger drew most of these terms and much of what he says in their regard from Kierkegaard. I believe, nevertheless, that his uses of the term and the larger endeavor within which they fit are farther removed from Kierkegaard's than Dreyfus and Rubin allow. In particular, they are deeply integrated with the explicit and overarching aim of Being and Time, which is to reawaken the question of being. For instance, Heidegger says about Being and Time in 1930, quote, "It was never my idea to preach an existentialist philosophy. Rather, I have been concerned with renewing the question of ontology, the central question of Western philosophy, the question of being." Accordingly, I take it as a sign of the incompleteness, at best, of Dreyfus and Rubin's reading that they do not so much as mention the understanding of being until their last few pages, and then only in the context of discussing how Heidegger's position evolved in subsequent decades. In the present setting, I will undertake neither to summarize the Dreyfus-Rubin interpretation nor to criticize it in any detail. Rather, in the space available, I will sketch an alternative approach that may better unify the various themes in Being and Time, and perhaps thereby illuminate them severally. In doing so, I will give pride of place to Heidegger's extensive and central treatment of death, surely one of the most striking and puzzling existentialist notions in the book. Indeed, it is so puzzling that the foremost exegetical questions is what it's doing there at all, that is, in a technical treatise on the question of being. Yet I will maintain that death, as Heidegger means it, is not merely relevant, but in fact the fulcrum of his entire ontology. Toward this end, it will be necessary to expound in outline that larger metaphysical project, and here it seems to me that Kant is at least as important and illuminating a predecessor as Kierkegaard. Specifically, Heidegger's inquiry into the disclosing of being as the condition of the possibility of comportment toward entities as entities is a direct descendant of Kant's inquiry into the forms of sensibility and understanding as conditions of the possibility of knowledge, of objects as objects. In Kantian terms, this could be called the transcendental question of the possibility of objectivity. In Heideggerian terms, that would become the existential question of the possibility of truth. Part 1. Traditional and Heideggerian concepts. All right, we'll continue this because really the meat of the whole discussion is going to come up in what follows. So I'll go ahead and do that in the same video instead of starting a new one. Part 1. Traditional and Heideggerian concepts. Heidegger is inevitably and self-consciously a follower in the Western philosophical tradition. But he is also attempting to advance and hence transform that tradition. This effort entails generalizing and/or transforming various traditional concepts, as well as introducing new ones. The most basic of Heidegger's innovations, in the sense that it's what all the others turn on, is his reawakening of the question of being. So that will be my main topic in this introductory section. Before undertaking to explain what being means, however, I need to review briefly 4 of Heidegger's other characteristic words: entity, comportment, Dasein, and disclosedness, and how they relate to their traditional predecessors. 1. Entities. Entities are all and only what there is. Everything that there is. No more, no less. Thus, if Quine were right that to be is to be the value of a bound variable, then entities would be all and only the values of bound variables. Now, the term object can be used in broader and narrower ways. Heidegger usually reserves for it a recognizably Kantian sense. Objects, Gegenstände in German, are the entities that can be known in explicit theoretical judgments, paradigmatically the knowledge attained in natural science. He also often calls such objects occurrent entities, Vorhanden, meaning that's, if you've ever heard of the ready to hand, present at hand distinction that Heidegger makes, it's the mode of being of the present at hand, which is what he means by objects, which is different from entity. Okay. He also calls such objects the Kantian sense. He often calls such objects occurrent entities. But according to Heidegger, not all entities are occurrent objects, or present at hand. 2 other sorts of entity are discussed at length in Being and Time. 1, available, or Zuhanden, entities, which include tools and other equipment and paraphernalia. And 2, existing entities, in Heidegger's proprietary sense of existence, which include Dasein and such Dasein-like entities as sciences and languages. Thus, all objects are entities, but not all objects. All objects are entities, but not all entities are objects. So Heidegger's term is a generalization of Kant's. Corresponding to that generalization is another. Heidegger is concerned with the possibility of comportment toward entities as entities. Husserl, following Brentano, had already generalized theoretical knowledge to intentionality, which includes other cognitive attitudes besides knowing, such as those characteristic of action and perception. But Heidegger maintains that everyday uses of equipment and interactions with other people aren't usually cognitive at all, even in Husserl's broad sense. Yet they are still ways of having to do with entities as entities. That is, not just interacting with things physically, as do sticks and stones, or even just actively and sentiently, as do animals, but in some way that involves understanding them as what they are. Thus, Heidegger speaks instead of comportment toward, which is even more general than Husserlian intentionality, though still not so general as to include whatever it is that animals do. Heidegger makes a distinction between human intentionality, which is genuine or authentic intentionality, and animal intentionality, which is something not quite the same on the same human level as humans. The generalization, so remember he's talking about generalization, transformation, or the invention of new concepts. This is what Heidegger does. And so the first one was entities, which was a generalization of Kant's objects. And then the comportment, which is a generalization of Husserl's intentionality. He's making things more broad, but not too broad. The generalization from intentionality to comportment toward is important not merely because the latter comportment toward, encompasses a wider range of relevant phenomena, but also, and mainly because, according to Heidegger, the further phenomena that it embraces are more basic. Comportment toward is not exclusively or even primarily a mental phenomenon, but rather, in the first place and usually, an active and competent taking care of business. Cognitive comportments, that is, intentional attitudes, including but not limited to knowing, are a special case that is not only different from, but also founded upon non-cognitive comportments, such as skillful engagements. Thus, the generalization is not made simply in the interest of thoroughness, but rather in the interest of addressing what is most fundamental. Okay, so we've covered entities. This is get where I think Haugeland really helps to get to the core of what, on his interpretation, uh, Heidegger's early phenomenology, his most profound or his most widely and most influential philosophy, what it's all about. And I think that that's why this essay is worth reading. I think I'll read the final chapter from uh, from his collection of essays, John Haugeland's collection of essays, um, called "Having Thought" in another video. But I'll continue in the next video. He's going to talk about let's see, the Dasein, which has got a really simple interpretation of that, and then disclosedness. And he's really going to help, I think, cut to the chase, cut to the core of Heidegger's philosophy or ontology. In the next video, we'll discuss Dasein. Thanks.